The Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew, the 14th chapter. Immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking toward them on the lake. But when the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost," and they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." The Gospel of the Lord.
Today's gospel lesson is often turned into a sappy morality tale about overcoming the stress that comes from stepping out into intimidating circumstances. But let's not reduce the full and beautiful message of the gospel to some self-help resource, as if the sermon's job is to instill in you the courage to overcome the things that produce in you anxiety and fear. You see, we don't need a Bible story in order to know that life is hard. And taking risks is sometimes good for us. You see, this is where the church often becomes a little oppressive. It teaches us that our failures in life are often somehow linked to our lack of faith, our shamed inability to be the good little boys and girls that God wants us to be. That if we were just better followers of God, that life would be easier, that life would be kinder to us. And we wouldn't have to deal with all the difficulties we often have to deal with. We go to church, and what we often hear is how we need to do better, to be better followers of God, so God will be a little less disappointed in us than usual. It's a wearisome message, hardly good news. So let's not abuse this lesson, indicating that the goal of faith is to become superhuman, where we can lull ourselves into thinking that we can actually walk on water. Rather, let's allow the story to invite us to become more fully human and to recognize the sacredness and the beauty of exactly who we are and where we happen to be in this moment in our own individual lives, but mostly in our collective ones. For we worship in community, even across this virtual experience that we have. We worship alongside each other. We are all in the same boat, as today's gospel lesson would imply. Well, most of us already recognize this basic story, and most of us have already allegorized it, jumping to platitudes about the storms of our lives, the power of having Jesus in our boat, and the need to let go and to let God. In other words, this particular story comes with a lot of baggage that might be best to set aside if we truly wanted to speak on its own, and perhaps even in a new way. Please, don't surrender this passage to floundering Peter and Baywatch Jesus interpretations just yet. And don't despise or ignore the story for its familiarity. For what is familiar is often a good place to begin where we are and to unpack our current reality, rather than doing what we often are inclined to do as human beings, and that is to use religion to ditch our current realities, opting out for something better or more attractive. We use religion to rescue us from ourselves, our own troubling stories. But this is no fairy tale, and the storm that rages around us is not illusory. Spirituality invites us to embrace the moment. It challenges us to step out more deeply into our own realities and into cultural realities that surround us too, with all the stormy seas and the strong headwinds around us. Well, Peter ultimately does just that, sinking beneath the surface before Jesus intervenes. Well, so much for faith, right? The storm was real for the disciples. The Greek word describing the waves is basanizo, which literally means torture. And the action of the wind is enantios, which means opposition. And so the boat is literally being tortured by the waves and opposed by the wind. And so you can see why either being in the boat, tossed from wave to wave, or having the audacity of Peter to step out onto the water, why either of those are hardly attractive choices. Rather get me to the shore, and I'll observe life's stormy seas from the safety of my chaise lounge on a sandy beach with a lovely fruity drink in my hand with a little umbrella in it. Oh yes, we long to be rescued by the hunky lifeguard David Hasselhoff, or Baywatch babe Pamela Anderson if you're old school, or maybe Zac Efron from the 2017 movie, or at the very least to have someone throw out to us a life preserver in our general direction. But when that doesn't happen, we are left to do one of two things: sink or swim. It was Puffer Coat Day, Puffer, Puffer Coat Day at Declan's and Harper's swim lesson this past week. Well, Declan and Harper, as you may know, are my grandkids, and traditional swim lessons have not really worked for them. So kudos to Jamie and Aaron for seeking unconventional ways to teach their children not to be afraid of the water and what to do should they happen to fall into a pool or a lake or suddenly find themselves in water too deep to touch the bottom. And so this past week, the kiddos showed up for their lesson, not in swimsuits, but completely dressed. Tennis shoes, pants, shirt, and wearing one of those big puffer coats. It's one thing to learn to swim in a swimsuit, but often in water accidents involving children, children are fully clothed. And so learning to maneuver in the water dressed in bulky clothing can be an important skill to master. Well, I'm happy to say that both Declan and Harper survived rather swimmingly, as they say, and are learning more and more how to maneuver on life's stormy seas. Well, most of us probably know how to swim in life's currents fairly well, but there are occasionally two variables that can take us by surprise and make the experience slightly more critical. Sometimes there is the basanizo in the issues that we face, which refers to the torturous waves, even riptides like depression and despair that surely intend to drown us. And then there is the enantios, the opposing wind, which might simply be all that baggage that we carry in life, like blocks of cement tied to our feet that want to pull us under the water. Can we really learn to swim with the puffer coat on? In other words, can this Bible story give us eyes to see how our common experiences, hopes, feelings, and frustrations might relate to God's presence and God's intentions? Perhaps we can agree that the thing about the story that seems most familiar to us is the paralyzing fear that engulfs Jesus' disciples and Peter, who in spite of his fear still takes a step out on faith, only to discover an even more terrifying sinking feeling that he had when he was at least in the boat. As many interpreters note, Peter's fear, the Greek word is phobia. It materializes even more dramatically when he sees around him the wind's ferocity, and then he begins to sink. Jeopardy arrives because his fear has transformed him or transformed his outlook. Of course, we can relate to that, can't we? Fear, although it is sometimes a very helpful self-protective instinct, it holds us back. Never underestimate fear's power to make us lie to ourselves and hinder us from moving forward. paralyzing us, basically. Fear adjusts our perspective. Well, not all types of fear are the same, and that's for sure. But Peter's experience on the sea reminds us of a specific kind, and that would be a titchophobia, which is the fear of failure. For it would appear that Peter's faith was not enough. And here's the problem of failure when it comes to faith. We tend to believe that failure places us outside of God's grace. I want to tell you that God expects more failure from you than you allow yourself. How often it is that when we don't live up to the standards of others, or worse, our own standards, that we withhold any possibility of grace coming to us. It may not be that God is disappointed in me, but that I am so disappointed in me, in myself, that I therefore refuse to allow God's grace to even come to me. In other words, I deny God's grace in those moments because I cannot see myself worthy of grace. Well, Peter failed as he tried to walk on the water. He failed miserably, and he failed wonderfully. If you think you should perform like some sort of superhuman, the illusion of that will fade very quickly. Peter began to sink. How often we set up impossible targets in our lives. It's like living in Palm Springs and setting up a target in Arizona. I'll give you a bow and an arrow. But even with all the practice in the world, and no matter how good you are at archery, you will never hit that target because no one could ever hit that target. Well, how many impossible targets have others set up for you? How many impossible targets have you set up for yourself? And so you miss the impossible target, and then what you do next is tragic. You beat yourself up for failing, when failing in so many instances is completely appropriate, and it means only one thing, that you are fully human. Peter didn't sink because of his lack of faith. He sank because human beings can't walk on water. You see, God expects more failure from you than you do yourself. And when you fail, it is God who is there to grab you by the hand and to place you back in the boat. Now, it does look like Jesus scolds Peter a bit for his lack of faith, saying, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" Well, I love the Message Bibles read on it, as Jesus says to Peter, "Faint heart, what got into you?" In other words, it's less of a scolding and more of an endearment. Remember, it wasn't Jesus who had the idea of Peter walking on the water. It was Peter's idea and Peter's faith experiment. And perhaps what Peter learned in that moment of failure is that it is hard to swim in a puffer coat. Well, the point is this. Some of you are way too tough on yourself. You look at your past and you see missteps that have created for you only strongholds of shame and guilt and remorse. You see a landscape left behind with regrets and bad decisions. And while as hard as you try, even now, you still make mistakes. You still blow it. You still fail at who you think you are supposed to be. You still fail at who others tell you you should be. And maybe you even believe you fail at who you think God expects you to be. Quit treating your spiritual life like the diet regimen you keep failing at. You keep falling off the horse and you vow to get back on it, and you ride a little ways further until you fall off again. Surely that is a horribly relentless cycle, this trying to do it all right, this trying to be perfect, this trying to walk on water like Peter tried to do. When we look back on our life, especially as we get older, we recognize that all the insights we've really gained in life have come out of failure and struggle and difficulty. God has no interest in your perfection projects, no matter how holy or spiritual they may appear. And that's why God is intentional about one thing: the gift of failure, frustration, loss, all these kinds of human experiences is when we come in direct contact with a kind of grace that we often don't allow ourselves to receive. As a new faith community, we have a choice. We will either create a place in here that welcomes full human experience, or we won't. Let there be no enforced happiness here, because if that's what we do, then this place called River of Hope will not be a safe space. We will become a church where if I really tell you the truth about who I am and what I'm suffering through, you'll reject me, or you'll question me, or you'll judge me. You'll put me on the outside or not include me in your little fellowship group. So I have to sort of check my humanity at the door and pretend. You know, we can place a sign over the door saying, let's pretend, because it feels like that's the mode in most churches, this sort of, how are you doing today? Oh, I'm doing great. Isn't it a beautiful day? Why, yes, it's a wonderful day, even though my body is falling apart, my relationships have soured, I'm suffering with mental illness, and my faith is basically non-existent. But yeah, I'm doing great. You know, remember, the gospel story should not be taken as a complete representation of our own individual lives of faith, for in reality, there are lots of folks out there on the water with you. All of us splashing around in the torturous Batsanizo and the strong Enantios, swells of insecurities and paralyses that, ironically enough, link us to one another. And if not in the water doing our best to swim in our puffer coats, then maybe in the boat, hunkered down, holding on to each other, aware that the one more powerful than the wind and the waves is there too in the boat with us. The grace of God is indiscriminate, foolish, impractical, unrealistic, crazy, and naive, and it wants to go to the place of your greatest resistance. The question isn't, will God offer to you the grace you need? But will you allow that grace to come in, to permeate even your fear, even your failure, and especially your fear of failure? Amen.